data would help sort of test interventions in a bed like this. So this is what that place looks like. So that's a field station surrounded by forest, as you can see, and then ag land as well. And this is where we hope that India will host, or is already hosting, the first One Health demographic surveillance site. So this is our campus that's coming up right next to that. But thanks for your time, thanks for listening, and thank you, Bindu.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramanan, for a wonderful and a very informative talk. So, hello everyone, good afternoon. I am Dr. Priyankana Mukherjee. I am a senior manager at IKP Knowledge Park, Bangalore Center. So now we will begin with a series of panel discussions on topics related to One Health. So we start with the AMR challenge, and for that I would like to request Dr. Tanjore Balganesh, who is the moderator of the session. So Dr. Tanjore Balganesh is president of Gangajan Biotechnologies Private Limited. He is former executive director of AstraZeneca India, and Dr. Balganesh will introduce the other panel members.
Thank you, Priyankana, and thanks, Bindu, and thanks, Dipanta, for having me here. And I think it is a challenge to deal with One Health. Sometimes when I think about it, I just get intimidated. Anyway, we've got some great panelists. Can I invite Dr. Sudeshna Adak, who is the CEO of Omics and has been working in the area of diagnostic for many years. She headed up the diagnostic division at GE, and I think you were in IBM before that. Yes. Got that right, please. Then can I invite Dr. Anand, who is the CEO of Bugworks, and many of you must have seen his photograph in various journals. He's also, he heads up Bugworks, founder of Bugworks, and as you know, they've got some really nice compounds into clinical trials. He's also very much involved in looking at pricing and how to access new drugs. Can I have Dr. Christopher McDevitt? He's been working on environment, he's been working on host-pathogen relationship, and especially dealing with ionophores. So that's the panel, and the way we're going to go through this for the next half an hour is what we have, if Bindu doesn't interrupt me before that. We should give you all a short introductions of ourselves, what background, as well as what we are doing and what's its relationship to AMR. So I'll ask Dr. Sudeshna to do the honors first, and then we'll go one by one, and then we'll follow it up by specific questions to each of the panels and panelists. And I've tried to focus everything onto AMR, so let's see how that works. Sudeshna, please.
Okay. So you want me to talk about what we are doing in the AMR?
No, talk about yourself and then your company.
Okay, great.
And why AMR?
Why AMR? Good question. So I started Omics about 8 years ago, trying to develop technologies that are high-end but can be used in places that are not high-end. So to make them accessible, affordable, all of these things. And to be very honest, when I started Omics, I did not start with AMR. In fact, I had never heard of AMR in those years. This was 2014-15, until a microbiologist who we were collaborating with told me, why don't you work on AMR? And I asked, what is that? So this was just a few years back, and we were that unaware of what AMR is in those days. So we happened upon AMR, and we felt that this is a problem worth working on because of what it is doing in India. And we faced a lot of challenges. We'll talk about that. But, some of the things that were true then is not true now. For example, in those days, we talked about NDM1. Now there are, I think, NDM1 to 30 variants. So just like we've seen Omicron, we've seen Delta, the bugs around us are also mutating rapidly. And that's been one of the challenges that we've been looking at and how to address that. So, but it's been a journey which has taught us many things, right from how to develop an AMR test, to try and sell it, and what are the challenges, not just in the lab, but also in the marketplace. So we'll talk about that more.
Thank you. Can I ask Dr. Christopher Michael to introduce yourself, say a little bit of your work, and relate it to AMR?
Sure, thank you very much for the opportunity to attend the conference and participate. So, my name is Professor Christopher McDevitt. I'm an academic at the University of Melbourne in Australia, but I'm also a theme leader for bacterial and parasitic infections in the Doherty Institute. And so the Doherty Institute's sort of a virtual, not a virtual institute, it's an actual institute that brings together the university as well as public health laboratories and Melbourne Health as a larger sort of cohesive entity to try and deal with challenges such as AMR. And so there's more than 300 people in our building that work on AMR, and this also involves multiple different research groups, embedded public health laboratories, as well as clinicians. In terms of scale, we've now just had a massive investment from an international donor to try and help us build up capacity in developing pandemic therapeutics, of which addressing AMR is one of those challenges. So in terms of the Doherty Institute, we're really focused on research as being one of our main components. As I said, there's an academic aspect of this, so it's about identifying and understanding new pathogens as they emerge, as well as developing therapeutics and diagnostics to detect them. There's also taking that information and feeding it back into One Health initiatives. That's part of our large approach in Australia in terms of ensuring that we work collaboratively, both with public hospitals as well as with the agricultural and livestock industries to make sure that antibiotics are being used as responsibly as possible. We also do a lot of work around diagnostics. We have molecular and phenotypic detection capabilities, and it's really important for outbreak detection, understanding where outbreaks are coming from, and are these of human, veterinary or environmental origin. And this also is really important because this helps us coordinate action plans at the state level in terms of supporting that through public health networks, and also collaborating with clinical studies around ensuring we're doing proper clinical trials, multi-centre trials, to understand the best way to intervene with respect to how we can best treat patients infected with AMR pathogens. So in terms of me, I'm actually a fundamental researcher. I'm really interested in understanding how pathogens cause disease within the host. I really want to understand how elemental aspects of disease, so metalines, how are they important in terms of host-pathogen interaction? How does the host remodel its interface to try and make it hostile to invading organisms? And how can we take advantage of that against key gram-positive and gram-negative bacterial pathogens? And so for that, you know, there's lots of aspects. We work both with contributing to AMR surveillance as well. That's working with industry partners, particularly veterinary-related or livestock and food-producing industries. So Australian Pork Limited, the Australian Chicken Meat Federation, as well as the cattle industry. And it's really important, one thing we're learning through those lessons, and I guess we'll talk about this a little bit later, is the importance of both novel pharmaceutical interventions as well as novel non-pharmaceutical interventions, because that's going to be a really key component in our post-antibiotic era as we move forward. And so we've been doing some consulting work and actually collaborating with some industry partners such as Ascend Performance Materials and PIPL, which is an Indian company, evaluating their technology just to show what capacity and what potential has to treat infectious organisms and our escape pathogens that we're particularly worried about through non-pharmaceutical interventions. And you'll hear a bit more about that technology later this afternoon from Dr. Gopal.
Thank you, Chris. Anand?
Thank you, BG, and the organizers for this opportunity. Actually, I want to shake you up a little bit. Why are we even talking about AMR, right? As a follow-up to Professor Ramanan's talk, right? Let's just understand how big of a problem it is first, before we talk about why we're here. So in India, we're losing somewhere between 7 to 10 lakh people per year 7 lakh is the official number that came from ICMR in Dr. Kamini's paper. We think it's probably more. 7 to 10 lakh year on year to people who are dying in hospitals because infection is untreatable. Mainly bacterial, fungal is also picking up, right? Of which probably 150K or so are neonatal sepsis. This is very serious. In many parts of the country, we have lost most antibiotics, and BG was telling me that the numbers are 70 to 90% resistance for leading antibiotics. We are left with colistin, tigecycline in many places. Fast forward another 3 years, no pipeline, no innovation, you run out of colistin, it's game over for modern medicine. I don't know how to state this without sounding like I'm exaggerating something, but this is why we're talking about AMR and One Health, right? So unless we as a country prevent, diagnose and invest in R&D, the trioca of all three, I think we are in big trouble, guys. It's 50 people from small hospitals dying every day that add up to that 7 to 10 lakh. It's not a COVID type of dramatic spread pattern, right? It's people dying, and then in our hospitals we codify that as multi-organ death, cardiovascular death, inflammatory misresponse, but the underlying cause would have been an untreatable Klebsiella. This is why this is so meaningful a topic. My own background, I'm a semiconductor physicist. I used to be designing computer chips in the US before I came back here. And then because of a medical condition I faced, I started a cancer company called Cellworks, and then spun out Bugworks in 2014. And the reason we spun out Bugworks is we started seeing the number of people dying in India. At the same time, all the big pharmaceutical companies left the space. Look at the perfect storm. Our companies in India do a great job, but their generic companies, fantastic in manufacturing. The big pharmaceutical companies left infection. Numbers are rising. So we said, why don't we do a company from India that can invent the next antibiotic? Maybe it's passion, it's naivety, it's ignorance, it's a little bit of all of that. At the same time, AstraZeneca, that this man led, AstraZeneca India, which has spawned off more than 20 companies in India, had decided to move off from infection. And I was very blessed that many of the team that Balaganesh put together joined Bugworks. And we decided, and we said one last time in our career, we're going to do something. We're going to invent a new broad spectrum antibiotic that can help pneumonia, bloodstream infection, abdominal infection, UTI, sexually transmitted diseases, and bioterrorism. That was where we started with. We used a lot of engineering, BG, when we started modeling and simulation. So a lot of bleed over of, semiconductor mathematics with microbiology, with clinical pharmacology. Many blind men and women trying to figure out the elephant. Maybe that orthogonal thinking helps. Maybe the non-science approach also helps in some parts. So here we are. And we are just trying to get into, we are doing clinical trials in Australia, and we hope we'll be successful. If we are, and many things line up and many planets line up, maybe in 4 years we'll have a drug. But, we're taking AMR head on. Thanks.
Thanks, Anand. Briefly introducing my work. I head up Gangajan, and at Gangajan we are looking at what you call as non-traditional antibiotics. I go back to this definition or classification that John Rex put together about a few years ago, where he differentiated. See, the problem in non-traditional and traditional is if you just say chemically one is small molecules and the other is large molecules, it doesn't work because you've got molecules on both sides. So what's non-traditional and traditional? That's a completely different story. It'll take me a long time to try and go over that, but basically non-traditional antibiotics are more or less biotherapeutics being used for infection, like phages or phage-encoded products, antibodies, monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, and many immunomodulators all come under, whether they're small molecule or large molecule, as long as they're not directly acting on the bug, are coming under this. So we are working on phages and how we can use phage-based products for the treatment of infection. We have a product from a phage specifically for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, which we've completed clinical trials in Singapore a couple of years ago. And right now we are also looking at a phage-coded lysine, for the treatment of Klebsiella pneumoniae. So that's the type of work that we've been doing. Now I have the privilege in 20 minutes. So Anand, I had this recent experience where we were trying to get some grants, international grants. And we had projected, for example, Klebsiella pneumoniae is drug resistant very much in India. But it's not much of a problem in the US and Europe. So the discussion then went that should a funding agency sitting in the US or in Europe fund something where it's not a priority problem? Now, what I want to know is, are we going to see, and maybe Lakshmanan was saying it's not, Ramanan was saying not, but is it possible that we're going to see that, India has, let's say, Klebsiella 90% resistance, so I have to find the funding mechanism for research on this. While most of the funding comes from the Western world, they're not worried about this type of a pattern. Are we going to see such demarcation? It brings back to, are we already funding enough to say, track such a problem?
Very, very important question, delicate question, because pharmaceutical industry, BG, as you know, spends 0.5% on antibiotics. 0.5% of R&D dollars go into antibiotics, very low. And most of the funding that keeps companies like mine alive, and Gangajan. By the way, Gangajan and Bugworks happens to be the two lucky companies working on AMR from drug discovery perspective in India, in all of India, and Wockhardt. So it's three, right? Two small companies, one large company. So BG, the big funding mechanisms are Carbex, Repair Fund, GARDP, hopefully on the clinical development side. And leave GARDP aside. You and I are surviving because of Carbex. We would have closed our company if we didn't get Carbex. We struggled to raise funding. We still will struggle to raise funding. Slightly better now than 2 years ago. Those companies are coming up with a TPP, target product profile, based on Western requirements. Acinetobacter and Pseudomonas drives that narrative. For us, we have a Klebsiella problem, which is a huge problem. 70 to 90% resistance Klebsiella. So BG, unfortunately, my answer to you is going to be brutally honest to say, we need to fix our own problems. Nobody is going to do it. So as part of people like you, Ramanan, others working with the government, we have to put dollars on the table. We have to treat anti-AMR like a defense infrastructure. Irrespective of how many cases you're going to use it for, you're going to spend money on a warplane or a warship, whether you use it or not, same way. And BG, really, if I'm only going to work on Klebsiella, honestly, we won't get funded. Whereas if our asset is touching Acinetobacter plus Pseudomonas plus Staph plus Neisseria gonorrhea, which are applicable to those few limited funding pools, naturally they will only fund those assets. So you are absolutely correct. We are a big country. We're entering the G7. I think we're the 6th largest GDP. Thanks to the way UK has gone and thanks to the way we have gone, right? We have to fix our own problem. Nobody is going to fix it for us, BG. And I feel whether it's 100 million, 200 million, 300 million, some allocation from Niti Aayog plus DBT plus DST has to come. They have to promote diagnostics and drug discovery that is personalized. I use the word personalized or customized for Indian needs. Otherwise, companies like us will only innovate for the West. I'm sorry to say so, if I have to stay alive. So this is the brutal, honest truth. Customization required, regio-specific innovation required. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand. Sudeshna. I think I alluded to this. So are we in a position where diagnostics are going to be replacing our age-old way of doing things? Or diagnostics is an afterthought, or is it going to be only in ICU? What have you seen?
Well, I would like to say that they would replace age-old culture. I think I'll be very honest to say we've been battling this. we have been in market. We have gone with our product to say that we can diagnose in 3 hours when when a culture takes 3 days. But to be very honest, there is a lack of acceptance, and there are reasons for that lack of acceptance. One, culture gives you information specific to each antibiotic, and you can get MIC data. So the doctor wants it, right? On the other hand, we say we can tell you whether it is a gram-negative, gram-positive, or we can tell you very broadly whether it is carbapenem resistant or colistin resistant. Now that is actually enough to make a clinical decision, but a doctor is used to seeing a culture report with 20 antibiotics and the MIC listed. So that is what it is not that it is not scientifically different, but it is what the doctor expects. So you're facing a market acceptance challenge in this situation, where the kind of information that a rapid test can give is different from what a culture test can give, number one. Secondly is price. A culture test is typically a lot less costlier. So what happened when we are in the market, when we are going to hospitals, the more rapid test comes to you actually when the patient is in a bad state. We did a lot of cases which were transplant patients, for example. Now, transplant patients, when they have a resistant infection and their immunity is already suppressed, you can understand what is happening. So we get transplant cases. By the time we are done with the diagnosis, they've either passed away or they're in a very bad condition. So will we replace age-old culture? I think there has to be a policy mechanism to say that, look, if a person comes with infection, you have to have a test. Today there is a test, for example, for TB. People cannot just give any antibiotic in TB, as you know, right? You have to have a confirmed molecular test based on GeneXpert or TrueNat or any other technology which says that you have TB and that you are rifampicin resistant or sensitive. But that is not true for the Klebsiella infections or even for the staph, right? Why not? So it has to be a combination of policy also which has to drive this change, because acceptance is otherwise not there. In the laboratories, people are used to culture, doctors are used to culture. The other funny thing which happens for us, or rather not funny but maybe sad thing, is if you look at it, we did a study on bloodstream infections. And typically the positivity rate for culture in bloodstream, as you know, is somewhere around 10 to 15%. So if a person has bloodstream infection, even by culture, you're only detecting 10 to 15%. So we said we'll be able to detect more. So what happens is, if you are detecting more, the question being asked was, you have false positives. So it is not that you are detecting more, you're finding the false thing. So we actually did the trial in 2 phases. One phase, the first part, we said we're going to test your blood culture bottles, we will run our test. So we correlated and we had like 100% correlation, meaning wherever the blood culture was negative, we were negative. So we're not detecting false positives. After that, we did a direct blood culture test. Then only we were able to pass this test of saying, look, if you detect too much, then are you getting false positives? The second challenge is also on the sample type. If you go to urine, urine has a lot of commensal bacteria. So if you detect it, is it really infection? So will it replace age-old culture? I think is a complex and messy thing, but certainly has to have elements of good products, good science, and policy. Otherwise, we're fighting a losing battle, it seems.
Thanks, Sudeshna. Chris, my question got some on
interplay, the depth of it, how is that driving AMR? Because those are really complex questions, and to really do those studies thoroughly, you've got to collect lots of samples, do the metagenomics, and then also be tracking what's happening with the evolution of resistance over time. I mean, but I want to would like to sort of point out we have been doing that at a relatively simple level in Australia, working with some of our food producing industries, trying to understand what's actually happening in the context of AMR in those populations, because obviously that's really critical to protecting those, what the WHO defines as those critically important antimicrobials that we need to keep surveillance on in order to see what's happening in animals in order to preserve them for human use. And so in Australia, what we've been done is we've done work with looking at the chicken meat, so the poultry industry, we've looked at the pork industry, and we've looked at the beef cattle industry, and doing antimicrobial surveillance with the industry bodies that have really helped us ensure that antibiotic usage has been done responsibly with those industries. And so that means we're not using third generation cephalosporins except in specific cases. Sometimes fourth generation cephalosporins not used whatsoever. Fluoroquinolones not used whatsoever. And so gentamicin not used whatsoever. And so that's the idea, that we're preserving those. Now, when we've done those surveys, this is a high income country, we've got very good compliance around the usage of these antibiotics in terms of what's being used in livestock and food producing animals. What we're seeing actually coming out of the surveillance studies that we're doing, and pork is really interesting. We've seen that, unsurprisingly, if you look at salmonella and E. coli isolates coming out of those pigs, they're non-susceptible to any of our frontline antibiotics. Kind of knew that the horse had already bolted on those particular ones. That was kind of already done. But what was concerning was we're seeing already low-level resistance to fluoroquinolones and third-generation cephalosporins. And then that's without any use in that population of animals. So we're getting resistance emerging over time to critically important antimicrobials. And it's a similar story in the beef industry. We're seeing that enterococci that are present in cattle, what we're seeing is, rather expectedly, we'd see that they're non-susceptible to a range of frontline antibiotics. They have increasing resistance to streptogramins, which is of some concern. But again, rather more concerningly, in enterococci we're seeing, so VRE, we're seeing they've got resistance to fluoroquinolones. So again, this is occurring without any antibiotic selection pressure driving the emergence of these resistance. So what that tells you, even in a high-income country like Australia, even with good, strict biosecurity, we're an island, we don't have these things coming in elsewhere. So it's what's happening within Australia. We're seeing these resistance determinants appearing in bacteria of concern with resistance to antibiotics that we were otherwise hoping would be shielded from the emergence of resistance. And so where this is coming from is a really interesting open question. We don't have that answer yet, but we need to, but this does highlight, the two take-home messages. We need to keep surveillance up, even in developed countries, around what's happening, because resistance is emerging without selection pressure. And we also need to, is start engaging with non-pharmaceutical solutions to try and control what's happening in these environments as well. We need to really step up our opportunities in those spaces with technologies like smart materials that are good for disinfection and other types of air handling and bioaerosol control as well, because if these things are resistant and they're in animals, we're risking transmission back into humans.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, sorry that we have to close this discussion. So thank you very much, Chris. Thanks, Sudeshna, and thanks very much, Anand. And we can address questions to any of us as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Vijay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balganesh. You need to rush to catch your flight at 6. So now we move to our next panel discussion. For this, I would like to invite Dr. Karthikeyan Vasudevan, who is scientist in charge of LECONS at CCMB, which is Laboratory for Conservation of Endangered Species, and would request Dr. Karthikeyan to welcome other panel members. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka. So, yeah, we've assembled here to discuss a very unique problem which has been highlighted by the speakers who came just before me, emerging zoonosis and climate change. So, where I come from, or my career has taken me to understand how free-ranging animals, those which are not tethered or maintained. So what this paper, which was published in Nature, talked about emerging infectious diseases, EIDs, and majority of them are zoonosis. And as we understand zoonosis, they are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans, and they pose a very important threat to human societies. So what they said is this globally, and India prominently figures in that. Parts of the northeast of India were all red. So they also said that there is substantial risk of wildlife zoonosis and vector-borne EIDs. And then they go on to conclude that there is a poor allocation for scientific and surveillance efforts, which really are very essential if we are to deal with EIDs. So it's 15 years since this publication came, and it required one massive pandemic that swept through the world, COVID-19, to remind us that we need to focus again back into the same issues that were raised in 2008. And intra and intergovernmental cooperation were very obvious, and we have tried to meet them, and somewhat we have overcome them, and we have come out of this pandemic in a fairly reasonably successful way. And when all this is happening, another group of scientific experts from different fields have been warning us of climate change repeatedly. And they have been highlighting that we are faced with a very serious problem of raising. There has been a lot of highlight given to how governments are going to be made to face this challenge by complying to the emission standards. But the two put together, which is the emerging infectious diseases or zoonosis and climate change, we have a real pot boiler, because we just cannot predict what is going to swing which way. Because since disease host pathogen dynamics, as diverse as the topic, and I guess it is studied with people who have these very diverse expertise. I'll just call upon each one of them to kindly come over and take your seat here. First, Abha Tiwari. She's a climate science expert, and she will be dealing with the climate change impacts and how it impacts emerging zoonosis. I will introduce all of you onto the dais, and then I'll give opportunity. Dr. Subir Majumdar, who's with the NIAB, National Institute of Animal Biotechnology, and he's also responsible for creating a One Health platform. Dr. Ramanan Lakshminarayan, whom we heard a very eloquent talk just a while ago, is the founder of One Health Trust, and Professor Christopher McDevitt, who was there in the previous panel from Doherty Institute, University of Melbourne. So I would put move the microphone with each one of you to please give your focus on this particular issue, which is emerging zoonosis and climate change, and what is your take on it, and how your work has provided some insights into how we can prioritize our efforts to deal with it. Yeah. Maybe we start with Ramanan. Yeah. Maybe we can go like this, or
okay,
would you like?
So just repeat the question.
Sorry.
So you want me to speak about
Zoonosis and the climate change.
Well, I mean, as I alluded to in the talk, there's many opportunities for human-animal interaction. Some of which are already in existence, which is simply the population, just the sheer volume of domestic animals which carry pathogens that are very similar to the ones that could infect us, and of course the sheer population of humans as well. And we're raising these animals in contexts which are close to human habitation, factory farming, and all of which could produce bird flu. Pigs carry, can have reassortment of viruses, flu viruses that could be quite harmful to us. Now, on top of that, we also have systematic destruction of forest land. There's much more human interaction with wild species because of that pushing into these wild frontiers. You see that in the Amazon. You see that in many parts of India, and some of this is driven just by existing agricultural land becoming marginal or unproductive. In fact, in India, something like 45% of land is degraded, and therefore people are pushing into other areas to try to find source of living or still to try to push in for agriculture to take on agricultural land. So I think all of these are not necessarily temperature related, but these are the sort of driving functions of the day. And I think at the bottom of this is the underlying factors that the demand for animal protein, the fact that every person on the planet wants to eat as much meat per year as, say, the average person in the Western world does, is simply not going to be sustainable. I don't think it was sustainable for the West to be eating meat at that same level, but I don't think we have the ability to produce that kind of animal protein. So these are all not necessarily climate, but they all contribute to climate, which then have feedback loops back into zoonoses.
Thank you. So I come from a climate science background, not from medicine background, so I can give you that perspective. So if you've been following the IPCC reports, you'll see that IPCC has been very emphatic and has been emphasizing in very strong words that we're heading towards a warmer future. And what has been the effort? Because climate change per se, if you say, it doesn't matter how much one country or one particular region of the world is contributing, the effects are going to be globally distributed. So post 2015, the change in approach, we know with initially the approach of climate community was on mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means you bring down the emissions so that you try to bring that, then contributes to a relatively lower increase in temperature, and then adaptation, because no matter to what degree you reduce the emissions, but the emissions which are there in stock in the atmosphere, it is going to take a lifetime. Whether you talk of carbon dioxide, or you talk of methane, or you talk of nitrogen dioxide, whatever GHG emissions you have, they still have a stock and flow balance, and because of their lifetime, even if you arrest all the emissions today, the stock that exists, it is going to manifest in terms of climate impacts over a long period of time. So even if you've mitigated, you still need to adapt. Now, our learnings over the last few decades, from MDGs we've graduated to SDGs, we've sort of expanded our focus more to include not only health, not only biodiversity, we are also thinking of sustainable consumption, we're talking of sustainable production, because overall the approach is that we are living in a planet which has got limited resources. We have outlined certain planetary bounds. Even if you look at India's contribution, we have 8 nationally determined contribution, of which only 4 are quantified goals. Rest all are based to adaptation. Some are conditional, which are based on subject to international aid being available to us, subject to finance, capacity building, technology support that is available to the country. So the IPCC analysis latest, it says that even if all the commitments, conditional as well as unconditional, are met, even if all the net zero pledges that were made till now, post 2015, are met, still we are heading for a future which is somewhere about 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius towards the end of the century. It has an error of plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. So a brighter side is 2.2 degrees. The worst case scenario we're seeing is 3 degrees. So it's not a very promising future. Now, if you look into, see what are the factors, we are looking for higher temperatures, we're looking for extreme weather events. Extreme not only in terms of frequency. Frequency means the number of events are going to go up. Also in terms of intensity. So the events are going to be even stronger. So you have a cyclonic storm, it is going to be more intense. You have a heavy precipitation, it is going to be very intense. And if we just have a look at, the recent weather events we've seen Bangalore flooding, we've seen floods over Himalayan states. So it is right in front of us, Now, you weave climate change with now the climate risk. We actually stopped calling it climate change. Now we started addressing it as climate risk, as Dr. Ramanan. Now that segregation between hazard to risk, we have already reached the stage where we are calling climate change as a risk. And it is a threat multiplier as far as the other thematic areas or other areas are concerned. So you have a risk, it is a threat multiplier, so it compounds the risk which is pre-existing. So let us take the example of cyclone Amphan. We have, at the peak of COVID, we had a cyclone which had hit Odisha, and the NDMA for the last few decades was credited for their handling of evacuation efforts, and the number of fatalities from that super cyclone we had in the early 90s, ranging to death figures reaching about 1 lakh, was brought down 10,000. The evacuation efforts were so good, and then we were dealing with figures which are less than 10. But with Amphan, you have a huge evacuation from the, where the cyclone was going to make a landfall. But then the biggest challenge was you had COVID in place, but your infrastructure for evacuation was not ready to support a population which could be safely socially distant. Then you didn't have the manpower because of COVID, people were working on skeletal capacity. So these are the new challenges which the pandemic has shown us. And are we prepared for us as it is if you assess the public health infrastructure that we have in our country? There's a lot of room for strengthening it. The national government is putting in efforts, but you put on it overlap a pandemic, and then we realize that we are no. So I think in terms of zoonotic diseases that we are discussing right now, what is required right now is you look at the way the climate is going to change the profile of your climate, your spread of strong national strategy to basically translate it. We need a strong framework to, outline into. When we talk of today, we are not talking of mitigation, adaptation in climate change domain. We're talking of building resilience. We're talking of systems approach. We're talking of critical infrastructure, because when you have, say, suppose a flooding incident and you impose on it a threat multiplier as climate change, so your flooding is going to be erratic. So the aftermath of the flooding, the direct and indirect impacts on health, your critical infrastructure in itself is going to get impacted because of climate change. Your access to roads, your primary health, your supply chain, everything is going to get disrupted in face of climate change. So have we catered that? I think we need to realign the strategy, think of overlapping climate change as a layer over every risk that we perceive currently. So we don't have a cooling. We're not looking ahead into a cooling future. It is a warming future we have ahead of us, and we need to plan for it.
Thank you, Abba.
Yeah. So I think most of it is covered, and I will just give you the glimpse of what really climate change has really affected, and is all human-made from the ages old. And we understand what we do to the climate and what changes are occurring can now be read with greater machineries and lot of data, but that data needs to be really collated well to make out a meaningful output of it. That's very, very important. And we all know that if there is a little temperature rise, and we know that from a low altitude, the vectors will try to move towards the mid or high altitudes, and that's how the transition for the disease carrying ability will increase. It has been, he's from Australia, so he knows very well that Hendra virus, Lazy virus and meningel virus, it's only because of the deforestation and the bats have migrated, and also in Malaysia, Nipah virus, the peri-urban plantation of the fruits. So they started getting attracted to it and they kind of ventured into it. So animals and human both became responsible for it. And if there is a dry season which is ending and a rainy season starting, Ebola has been increased, it has been seen, and it's also found the antiserum activities in bat has also been detected. And leishmaniasis vector, we all know that when the temperature and humidity rises, these vectors are high in number. And we have also seen that with the increased temperature, dengue rises, mainly because of the gonotropic cycle and of the vector and the female biting behavior. So see how that affects. And in Brazil, the high rainfall was associated with dengue. So if you simply see that before 1970, there were only 9 countries with the dengue fever, endemic. And now there are 100 countries. So it's all related to global change and very clear. And I would not talk a lot about how the climate really has done this. We all know and it's covered nicely, but I am saying that it's very, very important that we have to watch whether, when we say this global climate change, I would say we must focus on the regional climate change. So let us take India. It has got extremely variant agroclimatic conditions, starting from Himalaya to very rainy areas in Assam, and then central India, and central and western India, very dry. And so if you really want to have a real glimpse of what is happening because of climate change, you must have a strong group of people who should be addressing this. For example, what we started, we have 27 centers across the India. We have involved medical colleges, AIIMS Delhi, AIIMS Jodhpur, like that, several places, all major veterinary colleges, and also the wildlife, 2 centers of the wildlife. So they are in the northeast, center, mid-east, every part of the country. There should be a common working pattern. There should be booting camps. They should become friends of each other. They should know, there should be a common website that what they have to fill in. So they have to not fill in that in my hospital I have found 3 cases of, for example, any one of the zoonotic disease, let us say, and I will not name any, and let us say we go to Rajasthan and say CCHF, and then say what are the risk factors we find here. So there should be people who should assess what they call really as a risk factor for occurrence of the CCHF in Rajasthan. One is transboundary movement from the Pakistan, for example, because CCHF comes to our country from Pakistan. But at the same time, is it a rainy season? Is it very humid or dry on that particular month? And why it has come to human? There may be times when it was, the veterinarians can say, no, it is only in the animals. This year it didn't jump to humans. So you have to find out what were the risk factors for animals, but not enough to jump into humans. So from each side of the country, we must collaborate and work having a centralized website where we should have mathematicians, climatologists, meteorologists, and also epidemiologists, in addition to veterinarians, wildlife people, and medical people, so that you map exactly that in a particular region. Because zoonotic disease, we call it emerging zoonotic disease. What emerging means, it emerges from one place. So instead of talking only global change, we must immediately go like police to that emerging place and cordon off everyone and find out what are the factors which cause this, and ensure that in adjacent areas or in the remote areas, those factors do not accumulate, or if they accumulate, we should have enough preparedness. When we come to preparedness, I think this whole topic of One Health should be divided and categorized into 3 important things. One is epidemiological survey and disease forecasting. There should be a group of people who will be working only on this, which includes diagnostic of disease. And second should be preparedness and response. All of a sudden, if something happens, are we prepared? Are we ready for the response? What Dr. Renu Swarup was saying. Can we make immediately disease models? Do we have platforms for that? Can you make quickly antibodies so that we can have detection kits, any antigen? So that's preparedness. And third is ability to develop therapeutics quickly, as we did in case of COVID-19, vaccines, etc. And these three groups of people should be different. And climate change thing will come with the epidemiologist, and that should be centralized in my view. And I think for these medical doctors, wildlife practitioners, vet practitioners, climatologists, meteorologists, and also agriculturists, because here we should never forget when we talk about climate change, the soil health, because humidity and temperature regulate soil health. Agricultural practices regulate soil health. So there is a lot of climate change because of the aggressive agricultural practices. So the manures you add can raise ability of the microbes to grow. And animal as well as human both feed on those microbes when we take the vegetables. So this is very, very important, and I think I will stop here. And if there is any further question, you can. Thank you.
Yeah. Chris.
Thank you. So, look, I think I echo everything we've already heard, but I've got a good example of a situation where we've had an emerging zoonotic disease that's been linked to climate change in Victoria. And this is work that was done in the Doherty by my colleague, Professor Tim Stenier, which was to really track down where this flesh-eating Buruli ulcer was coming from, because it suddenly went from 0 cases in the 90s to having nearly 300 cases a year by 2020. And so this disease essentially came out of nowhere. And what was really surprising about this, which is the bacterium, Mycobacterium ulcerans, which causes this soft tissue infection where it gets in under your skin, starts to secrete toxins that break down your fat cells under your skin, and you get this really sort of cosmetically unpleasant looking ulcer that can be very difficult to treat and very sort of complicated in terms of opportunistic secondary infections. Now, it's not fatal, but what was really interesting is it wasn't human-to-human transmission. It couldn't transmit between people directly, so it was coming from somewhere else. And this was really an engagement with citizen science, tracking down, looking at what the possible reservoirs for this disease could be. It was actually through getting people out there, collecting different types of fecal samples, we were actually able to identify that it was within the Australian possum population. So with Australia, all our native species are protected. So we live cheek by jowl with possums in the trees, flying foxes around the place, kangaroos, all those things you think about, we actually have them in our coastal environments. But particularly, a lot of people have been moving down to the coastal regions in Australia through this period where this disease emerged. And so we were getting humans encroaching more closely in that environment with animals. And so it was speculated that maybe interactions with possums could have been the cause. But there wasn't enough people actually getting exposed to possum fecal matter that you could think where these infections were coming from, because it always seemed to be associated with a bite. And that's where it was when we were actually charting what was happening in concert with people moving in these areas, getting some habitat destruction. We're also getting coastal erosion and increased rainfalls associated with this region because of climate change. And that's when people realised that perhaps there was another vector involved, and sure enough, it turned out to be that mosquitoes were the primary source. Mosquitoes were biting possums and then flying around and then biting a person. And that was the primary vector for transmission. This Mycobacterium ulcerans was being transmitted directly to humans from mosquitoes, but actually the reservoir was back in our possums. And so this is a treatable infection. This is where we're at now. We can treat it with a combination of rifampicin and clarithromycin, but it can take up to 6 months of continuous antibiotic treatment in order to effect a cure. And some of these deeper, sort of larger abscesses can actually require surgical intervention. And so rapidly developing new therapeutics isn't always an option, particularly with some of these obligate intracellular pathogens or other organisms that are very good at hiding from our antimicrobial control mechanisms. So what we're trying to do at the moment is try and break that chain of transmission. Can we vaccinate possums to make them not carry the disease? Can we try and treat the mosquitoes, trying to wipe out the mosquito population and try and break cycles of transmission? That's where we're at the moment. But the key thing is here, this was really a community effort and a lot of genomic tracing to identify and map the regions where we have this endemic in our possum population, and so where we have risk factors for the Victorian population going forward. But it really is an interesting sort of test case for where we've seen both a combination of climate change driving a zoonotic pathogen into the human population.
Thank you. I think these are all great points. I think I didn't expect such a vast breadth of information being brought in so nicely from all four of you. I just had a few takeaways which I thought I'll share with the audience, and which is like Abha mentioned about climate change adaptation. And it looks like by addressing the issues of zoonosis or emerging infectious diseases, we are in fact trying to adapt to a changing climate, because there is a very strong influence of climate change on vectors moving from place to place and new pathogens emerging while they were not pathogenic, now becoming pathogenic. And from what Ramanan spoke about, it looks like if you have solutions for better farming or replacement of animal products, we might actually address climate change as well as reduce burden of antibiotics being dumped into the environment. So there seems to be some connection there, because I think the major source of methane comes from farm produce. So if we do find replacements for animal products, say, I don't know, soybean milk or something which is a replacement for the cow's milk, or, you know, lab-made meat, or substitute vegetarian, you know, substitutes for animal products. So I think we can find solutions there. And what Dr. Subir was mentioning about vectors moving, that's a very serious concern. I think traceability, tracking movement of pathogens, vectors are going to be very serious challenges for us, given the climate change is already set in, right? And Chris clearly outlined a fantastic case study where, you know, tracing one pathogen to a possible vector and an animal host, which eventually led to solving this disease in Australia. And it took so much time and effort and research. And I think the whole plea that Jones made 15 years ago is still valid, that we need to invest more in trying to find out how the pathogens are moving with the vectors or without the vectors, and how we are becoming more and more susceptible to these in the changed environment. Yeah. So I think with this we wind up this panel discussion. Yeah. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dr.
So I will actually call my panelists right now to the stage. Let's make it a panel discussion as we would like to. So could we have our panelists? And Anu? She was here somewhere. Oh, there she is, yes. Dr. Vikram Gopal, I never got to meet him actually. We will meet him now. And Dr. Rakesh Mishra. We have two mics that work, right? Okay, so then I'll just sit there because I'll have one. I'll just sit here. If there is one more, yeah. The best way I figured would be to have a panel discussion is to have we are almost going to assume that you don't exist. And we are going to try to have a conversation amongst ourselves. And if we don't find it interesting, it is unlikely that audience will find it interesting. So it's a fairly simple philosophy. Now, just to set the context, because One Health, I've been part of this field for now more than a decade, or even before, because I was trained as a veterinarian. I worked in human health, and I came back to this, and I worked with Ministry of Environment and Forest. There used to be a time where if you set up a meeting and call it One Health, people would hardly show up. And COVID changed that. So much so that I cannot make a turn and not hear One Health. And now we have the problem of the riches. That is lack of an operative definition, because when you look around the definition, it is everything, planetary health. So now I have to go to Mars to escape One Health. So everything gets covered. So then that's like world peace. So when it is about everything, it is almost about nothing, and very hard to build strategies and build solutions. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm just going to define it as addressing infectious diseases. AMR got covered, so we don't need to keep rehashing it. So when I say infectious diseases, we are now talking about human health compartment, livestock compartment, and wildlife compartment, and they exist in an environment, let's just acknowledge. And these infectious diseases I would just categorize as zoonotic diseases, meaning diseases that somehow impact humans and have some other compartment involvement, and so-called transboundary animal diseases. These like foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease, we don't have the risk of acquiring the infection as humans, but it is a problem for livestock and problem for wildlife. And within that there is a subcategory which is diseases of epidemic and pandemic nature. So that's our scope, and to address those we need a disease control strategy, which I would say preventive solutions, all the things we do, vaccinations, routine public health preventive measures, and we need to know where the diseases are spreading, how they're spreading, etc. That's integrated disease surveillance. I use the word integrated because we want to take into consideration these compartments. And outbreak response, so even with your best efforts, diseases come out and outbreaks happen, and when you address it, you want to address it in an integrated way that makes sense. Anthrax just being addressed at a clinic but not looking which was the source of it is not going to be very useful. And pandemic preparedness, because pandemic preparedness, we know that price we pay is pretty high, and the insurance policy costs far less than when we just try to address it. But pandemic preparedness in and of itself is not really going to stick, and we are already stopped wearing masks, and 6 months from now, if no crazy new variant of COVID emerges, we will have moved on. So unless we build it on top of existing systems, it won't stick. So that's basically part of this. Now, thankfully, these phenomenal moderators, I didn't put it together, but they happen to complement various aspects of this cycle. So I would like to just wanted to set up the scope so that we don't go all the way because of short time available. Now I'm going to basically start passing along mics and ask questions. I'll start with the prevention side. Like one of the most useful and dominant preventive solution is vaccines. Now, one of the problem is that to develop vaccines costs resources, whether it is research or development, and if the diseases are some things that we don't yet have, or it's in a small footprint, like CCHF, and unless you are in this system, you wouldn't know what that is. KFD, like 20 kilometers from my hometown, Casnur Forest, you wouldn't know if you didn't know that. But it's a matter of time they become a problem. And when they become a problem, everybody is scrambling, and like monkeypox, we are trying to solve it. So my question to you, Dr. Ella, because you are in the vaccines business, how do we prepare for these at the R&D side when there isn't a market, and as a private entity, that's not something investors would be, going gaga about and putting money about?
I think fortunately, I don't have much to investors. So that's one good thing happened. So as a scientist, I can take whatever decision I want. So scientists are always crazy people. They believe what they believe in, they execute. That's what we do. But I think, we took a strategy decision right from the beginning, 20 years back. We want to be niche over the multinational. The only way to be niche is the neglected disease. I'm a strong believer all neglected diseases are turned out to be mostly in Asia and Africa. And all neglected disease turns into pandemic. You look at all neglected disease, SARS-1, MERS, and yellow fever, dengue, every disease was neglected before. Today turned out to be global pandemic. So we took the strategy decision right from the beginning. Covaxin has not come by an accidentally. We have amazing background before. So we were the first one to make a chikungunya vaccine. When DBT said it's useless vaccine, but we still pursued the project. Now it's in the phase 3 efficacy with CEPI funding in other part of the world. And we were the first one to make a Zika vaccine, which again found neglected, will turn out to be a pandemic in 2014. By 2015, December, pandemic in Brazil. And pandemic flu we made. So I think, I'm able to visualize that we need to work on a neglected disease, whatever neglected disease it is, part of this Asia, and focus quite aggressive research in the beginning, right in the beginning. Pandemic, you cannot act once pandemic comes. When you start acting, then never succeed. That's how many countries fail, because they couldn't succeed to make it happen. So you need to have a strong base of R&D and focus on a neglected. For a particularly like India and Asia and Africa, really should focus on a neglected disease. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to add ask one more question and then move on. What could government do to help facilitate what R&D ecosystem does to facilitate and enable that?
I mean, our system has to change quite a bit. Whether it is, we try to, when something we want innovative in India, we are more regulated than the others. So when you have a good science and a good technology, and we are still follower of Western world, unfortunately. West has done, then we do it, then it is okay in the regulatory system. The regulatory system, they don't look at strategically, this is right for the country, we need to move ahead of the other part of the world, we need to take a leadership role. That strategy thinking should be there. They suspect industry is going to do something wrong. They're going to kill the people. I think we are the last people to kill anybody in the world, because we are the commercial company. We are more conscious than the government. As a private company, okay? So I think that people, regulators has to change their mindset, start thinking in different directions, and think that Indian leadership is more important than Indian company. Okay, they have to look at a global picture. So we are not looking at a global picture. So we always, you have to do preclinical toxicology for 1 year, and you have to do phase 1, you need a phase 2, you need a phase 3. Whereas monkeypox vaccine in US and Europe got phase 1 and phase 2, no even animal studies. Phase 1 and 2 approved. US FDA approved, Europe is approved. Monkeypox, no phase 3, not even animal. Even mRNA vaccine in US, no animal challenge studies, no monkey studies, no preclinical toxicology, entered directly into phase 1. Whereas India, no. So they suspect that Indian innovation is a belittle, and you put down and put more regulation. Not less regulation, more regulation. I think that has to change the country.
Thank you. No, I think we will keep coming back to this theme. I would like to move to another aspect that is probably, since that was something that your background also is related to, is the other side of the either prevention or diagnosis, both. How do we think about this from a device perspective? And device is a very broad word for me.
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So again, thank you. Good question here. So, prevention is the best form of cure, if you think about it. And all the discussion we've had so far has talked about the fact that there's an antibiotic resistance that's building. And I know you don't want to necessarily talk about AMR, but you can't not talk about AMR in this context. So in our case, our focus really is around materials and what can you do and how can you make smart materials that actually help with the prevention side of it, so that the vaccine can come in, and it takes some time for vaccine to develop, because oftentimes you don't know what you have, what is the mechanism and what is the organism you're dealing with. And to do that, you need a broad spectrum antiviral or antibacterial type of product, which is self-cleaning. That's one aspect that becomes an important part. And we've been focusing a lot on that. And that's why we've been working with Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Velthius, just to say, you know, do we understand the fundamentals of how this works? And how do we do this in a way that we can actually incorporate the active material within the polymer matrix, so that that matrix then can be converted into various end forms, because you don't know what type of end form do you need. Do you need it in masks? Do you need it in PPEs? Do you need it in shoes? Or, you know, and what do you need? So you need something which is easy and scalable. That's what we've been focused on. The second piece is also, once you have smart materials, you also need to have smart engineering and engineered innovations so that you can actually make devices out of it. So if it turns out bioaerosol is a problem, which it is when you think about all the infection spreads, how do you actually get to a point where you know, you can actually have a device that can actually do the cure so that you can keep the environment clean? That's what we focused on.
That's a very interesting area that I hadn't thought about until, I mean, obviously the crisis we hit. Getting masks was such a problem, and people then realized some things that seem so simple can become bottleneck. Now, from a fundamental principles standpoint, for something to become really logarithmic rise and a pandemic, respiratory route is by far the most common one, and that's something we kind of know. It's a matter of time we think about it in the next future. How do we think about that now? From a material standpoint, if I tell you the next pandemic is likely to be respiratory borne, and it's not like it's an aha moment or anything, what do we do now? Now, there is two questions there. One is from an R&D standpoint. Is there anything novel we should be doing, or we should just be getting better at having masks available at scale, or is there any new thinking in the horizon there? And second, same question that I was asking Dr. Ella, where do you get the funding? Because right now, if you make it, who do you sell it to?
Again, great question. So it finally kind of comes down to looking at what has happened and what are the mega trends, right? So seriously, if you look at the last 30 years, the number of outbreaks has gone up 5x, okay? If you look at the types of, what are the organisms that cause it, 90% of them are either bacterial or viral in nature, out of which 60% are zoonotic, okay? So when you now look at this, that trend is not going to change. And by the way, 80% of all the infections are respiratory. So, fundamentally that is going to remain the route. We can work on other things, but this is the main route and this is the main thrust. So as a CTO of a company, it becomes rather critical to have these multi-generation product plans so that you actually got platforms that you're looking at what is coming next and how can you be ready for it while the core business continues on. Because you have to be ready for it. And in our case, just think about it. We had an antimicrobial solution in Jan of 2020, where the polymer was already scaled up. We knew what we needed to do. And then I was in India because my father had unfortunately just passed away. And I was looking at the China situation, and we didn't know how to make masks, let alone masks were needed. But I had told my team there, start buying masks, start deconstructing it, and let's see how we can utilize our material. And it turned out to be very, very helpful. Because in the meanwhile, I had really great colleagues and really great collaborators in Dr. McDevitt and Dr. Velthius, because they did everything they could to actually take the material, get the test protocol, make sure it works. There's a whole aspect around getting registration in the US and kind of getting approvals. That's a whole different piece. We can do all good science. The regulatory science is a very different science, and it takes time anywhere. India is a bigger problem, but West is not as easy as well. But the thing though is you need to kind of base it on good science. Once you know it's good science, you know how to go ahead and position your product. So it really kind of comes down to leadership of the company, looking to see where the trends are and getting ready for it up front.
What can government do better to help you with the ecosystem?
You know, so first of all, I don't think...
Regulation, I heard, other than that?
So the other piece that really is very, very important is we need to have national stockpile programs. Okay, now in the US today, just think about it, just before the pandemic, the national stockpile program was neglected to a point where there were not enough N95 masks, there were not enough PPE, and then there were not enough nitrile gloves. Those are all problems, and suddenly we realized it, and there was an issue. And by the way, initially what we were doing is we were helping our Chinese counterparts and friends because they were in trouble, and we were seeing what was going on, and we were shipping it, only then to realize that we also had a fundamental problem. And the thing what you got to do is, much like we have the oil reserves, we need to have stockpile programs such that you can actually have these, have critical pieces and PPEs so that you can actually have the ability to store it in a form that you can do conversions later on, because you don't know what form you need it in. You need critical pieces stored in forms that you can do what you need, so as to get ready and give our friends on the vaccine side enough time to develop. Because it's a synergetic thing. It's not one or the other. We need every one of these.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, actually. Continuing the thread, in this cycle, surveillance is a very critical part of it. You need it to get an early signal if you are thinking of pandemics, but you need it for routine diseases, of whether it is TB or malaria or dengue or in animal diseases. Now, when I think of surveillance, information comes from different sources, and one is clinical side, where people go about and their job and they get health care, or they get care for their animals, or forest guards going around and doing their thing. How do we harvest that information? They're not doing it for disease surveillance, they're going about, and actually that is the richest and believable information. And the second one is actually active or passive surveillance done for surveillance. So there, I would love to hear your thoughts, not only what you are currently doing, but also let's expand it and imagine we have a whiteboard today, and how do we construct it ground up?
So thank you. I mean, it's you just heard in the keynote address as well, and now it's very common knowledge that probably environmental surveillance is most economically viable and most reliable way of knowing the health of the city as far as infectious diseases are concerned. And we have established that well in Hyderabad and also in Bangalore for almost 1.5 years now. On a weekly basis, we give information to BBMP in which ward how many cases are there. I mean, and the sensitivity of these methods, earlier I didn't believe actually that you can do serious surveillance to this precision. If one person is infected in 1,400, 500 people, you will pick it in there. So it's amazing. So in fact, what we are thinking now is how to implement it as a routine thing of every city in the country. So we are now doing a 4-city program, which is funded by Rockefeller Foundation very generously, where we are establishing the SOP for collecting the sample, a strategy to collect sample with what frequency, and then doing the molecular biology of that, isolating it, and establishing whether for a specific pathogens, or you can have a panel of pathogens, or certain frequency you can do metagenomics and even look for the newer things that might be appearing. And as we accumulate the data, we get the dynamics of this. And there are other strategies that had to be put in place, for instance, at what frequency, in which year, and what is the correlation with other vectors and other aspects. So there are many aspects of those. And very important part is also the indigenization of the sample collection methods. So if we can automate, it becomes very easy. Right now, most of the places we do is manual, but it can be automated, and we need indigenization of those equipments, not very big ones. and the same way the indigenization of the reagents that we need, because these are something which I think is going to be used by every municipality, every small city on a regular basis. And the other component which we are doing in next 2 years, we are going to establish all this, is to train the human resource of entrepreneurs who are now willing to offer this as a service. The only thing before you ask that question, the only thing we need from the government is to make it compulsory that these samples are provided to people who are going to test and give you the data. And then they can be also done the genome sequencing, and you can actually, we have been knowing which kind of variant is coming, not individual basis, but what % of variant in which part of the city it is. And then we should not be afraid of the information, which is very important, because if we are afraid of the information, we'll hide it and it becomes a bigger problem. So I think we should be very bold to accept if the infection is increasing, let's face it, because it will come, right? So we should not try to hide it. And this, I think we have learned the hard way in this pandemic, and as a policy, we should make it really something like people deserve, or they have the right to have the information.
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan of surveillance techniques that are genomic platform based, and they are going to become less and less expensive and quite sensitive, and also it's not people dependent. People may refuse to share their samples, but they can't stop going to bathrooms, and you will pick it up. But I'm not going to let you off that easily. So I see a problem. That is, I have no doubt that you will pick up 20 best in the...
Keep giving to researchers who will generate models, who will put the trend and will generate predictions, and which will be very, very useful. And it also depends on the first user of the data, which is the municipal body. And I will put on record the appreciation of the BBMP that each ward, when we
Karnataka,
Bangalore,
like
GHMC here. Yeah. So when we have picked the peaks during, like say, Dashara or later parts, certain parts which did come in the news, but then they go and take action and figure out whether it's the human behavior or a new variant is appearing, because we have the variant data as well, and they take appropriate action. In fact, they keep telling us, now you use this pathogen also, you tell us about dengue and many other things. So there are users immediately, actually. So if we keep doing, see, the city knows if you know 10 cases, which means there must be at least 100 or 1,000 cases, because people don't go to dispensary, or unless they are, because if they go to dispensary, most of them will not earn that day their money. So they will be avoiding that. But as you said, in the sewage, we will know what is the number. So we will have the exact situation, which will be useful not only for city authorities, but the healthcare system as well. And then once we have generated the data and it is being modeled by the researchers, the government has to make a policy, which I don't see any reason why they will not make, because that's a useful thing for them to have. So they are the final users of this. But I think there should be a cycle that the circuit, in the sense that data is generated in the lab, given to municipality first for immediate action, given to researchers for making it and generating models and refining it and doing the course correction, and then somebody should make sure that this cycle is continuing, and the knowledge that is generated from is put to use for making policies and preparedness for, and it will of course depend on different disease in different ways.
Right. And how do you stitch those priorities of different diseases into a coherent program is where the trick is. So I would like to come to you, because what Rakesh was talking about is at a population level. And so now my questions are twofold. You deal with individual level. I would love to hear your thoughts on how do you bridge the information from individual level and extracting that information in a useful way for a population level prediction. And also, where do you see role of private sector in this? I am struggling with this.
Sure. So I think, when we talk about One Health, it's also one's health, right? And when it comes to one's health, you're looking at understanding.
That's a good slogan. I'm going to copy it and
you're also looking at not just understanding what is happening on a mega trends, but also understanding what's happening at an individual level, right? So you're looking at the host genomics, which is what we would study, right? Understanding what is going on with that individual. But I think, at the end of the day, your own genomic data is your data. But as a citizen, if we can encourage people to be able to share this in a bigger platform that maybe can be enabled, then I think we get better and more smarter trends, right? So when you look at, for instance, if you're saying that, there is a risk for certain kinds of nutrient deficiencies and various other things that may predispose specific populations to, a particular kind of disease or something like that, I think that information can be very valuable ultimately overall, right? So that's one piece of the puzzle that I think we can probably start to figure out how do we actually get that information and how do we encourage people to share that information. And maybe that sharing of that information could be something that the government could build as an infrastructure that can be able, we can actually ultimately see that. So that could be one part of the thing. The second part is also that I think our human body is not just our own DNA. There's also DNA from, we have microbes and viruses and other things inbuilt into our system. So whether it is understanding of the microbiomes and others also is an interesting part to be able to understand overall, the One Health problem that we may face in the future. The second question that you asked, which was, how do we understand what do private players have to do with it, right? So one is that, in the case when COVID was going on or other things, we are the first people that people come to for instance, for testing, right? So an average person walks into a clinic, either goes to a government hospital or comes to somebody like us. So we get samples, right? Now people might be interested in sequencing their sample. There are curious people across the country. So you can take those samples, make sure you sample, create a commercial model that will allow commercial companies to sustainably do something like this, but also incentivize us to be able to then share that data, because that data is going to be very valuable ultimately to the government and to all of us, because we are all connected, right? I think that was this thing that said we are like a spider web. So if one of us is unwell, I think, or something happens from an infectious disease level, I think ultimately it will spread. So I think we have to do two things. One is, how do we make it more inclusive? Because creating an inclusive environment that allows private players as well as public players and not look at each other with suspicion that we are doing something differently, I think that would really enable us to be able to move one step further towards the One Health.
Thank you. No, I think there is a huge missed opportunity by not tapping into this. And this information should be available to product developers too. So if vaccine manufacturers or device manufacturer materials, their industry has an access to information on what is the trend, what is changing, it actually helps everybody. And by holding that, we actually are constraining ourselves in many negative ways. The next question I wanted to ask is for anybody to answer or all of you to talk about. I lived in the US for 16 years and I came back and I work in the government, and I have funded or facilitated international collaborations, and I find it quite an interesting spectrum. On the one hand, global collaborations helped immensely in moving things forward very rapidly by bringing complementary pieces. I could go on number of these collaborations, whether it is Serum and Oxford, or I can go on with many of your products too. On the other extreme, supply chain resilience is something we talk about, and some of my own colleagues in the government, we cannot really trust anybody. We have to be fully self-sufficient. How do we become fully self-sufficient?